Hello everyone! Today's video is a little bit about kind of George Orwell. I have read these two books recently. So this one is Wifedom by Anna Fonder, which is basically a non-fiction about Orwell's wife. And this one is Julia by Sandra Newman, which is about Julia, who is the woman in 1984. So they are kind of feminist retakes on Orwell and Orwell's life. And especially this one, I think it's important because we don't know much about Orwell's life and in terms of his wife. He doesn't seem to put a lot of feminine energy in his books, and even though I love some of his books, that is really lacking. And so these books prompt me to think about what is the role of women in Orwell's life and Orwell's oeuvre based on these two books, and also like what happens with problematic authors, because based on this, especially this one, Orwell was a fairly problematic person in terms of his view to women. And yeah, here Anna Fonder explains how misogynistic Orwell was in so many ways, and knowing this about him so bluntly, it makes me think about, indeed, like his books are fairly misogynistic and fairly like there's a clear lack of women in his books. It's indeed very male energy. And I just thought that when I read those books, it's just the time that he wrote them in. It must just be how it is. But reading this, it really does open my eyes to how, in fact, he was in his life, but also that looks into his work. He was fairly misogynistic, and he was like really not giving women the value. Like, for example, in 1984, the woman in the book, even though it's one of the main protagonists, she gets really low amount of pages and character development. And it's funny because in this book, Julia, obviously she's the main protagonist, but she kind of looks down at Winston, who is the main male protagonist. And he is not even like a little part of this book. It's very small part of this book in some ways, and I think that's also intentional, because that's obviously, as much as Julia is part of 1984, Winston is part of this. And if you look at him from this perspective, he looks very naive, and he looks very like very inflexible in his ways, because of the way that he perceives the world is very black and white, and Julia knows all kinds of things about the world that he doesn't know, and so she's more about survival, but also about like just survival because she knows more than him, so she knows the consequences of her actions much more than he does. He's just a naive guy that believed everything that the government said, and suddenly he starts realizing that some of those things are not true, and so it's like he opens his eyes and it's like, wow, this whole new thing existed when she knew all along that it existed. And in that sense, these are similar, because here also we see Orwell in real life. For example, when he went to Catalonia to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and he's in the trenches, and like it's very one-sided kind of thing. And his wife was in Barcelona organizing the movement in a much more risky way and a much more complicated way. So there are like those things that, actually Orwell might have been a fairly simple man in some of the thoughts that he had. Yeah, it's interesting, and as I said, it also made me think about the way in which we see authors that are problematic or become problematic. And I have to be honest, after reading this, I was hesitant. I am hesitant to pick anything else from him, because I think I now have a different lens on his work, and I'm not sure I'm gonna enjoy what he writes anymore. And the author here also talks about the fact that she also loved Orwell, and now she has this this dilemma to deal with. That what do you do when one of the authors that you admire is actually a rubbish person? And I think it really depends. I think for me personally, um, depends on how much knowing that affects your reading of those books. So for me, for example, reading this, I now have a view of Orwell that will seep into his work, and I will see it in his work as well. And so for me, I'm not sure if I will want to read any Orwell anymore. But other problematic authors, like let's say Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I really admire her thoughts on race and her thoughts on like feminism. And I know that she has expressed some transphobic sentiment, and I'm totally against that. And so if you don't want to read her, I think that's amazing. For me, I don't see those thoughts and those feelings on her books. I don't think any of her books comes across as transphobic as such, and so for me, I can still enjoy those books even though I know the author was transphobic and is transphobic. Whereas for Orwell, um, I I do admire some of his commentary on capitalism, but knowing what I know now, the lack of feminist view and the almost misogynistic view of some of his books does affect the way I read them. Um, and so yeah, all these things have been coming across in my head lately because of reading these two books. Because yeah, it's also tricky, and for some reason also some people seem to have a different take when the author is dead. And in some level I understand. Like obviously we cannot judge people from a long time ago with our current ethical prompts. But I do still believe that if even if it that in some way justifies those views, I do still think that if it's distressing to someone, you still don't have to read it. And a different example that is not exactly the same, because I don't think that's very problematic, but I find many of the Victorian classics that everyone loves, like Jane Eyre, the Brontes, all of that, I find them rather blunt, because at the end of the day they're love stories, and I'm just not really interested in reading love stories. I think if those books were written today, they will just be shelved in the romance section, and only people that like romance will read them. And so for me, I'm not interested in romance, and there's nothing wrong with it, but I'm just not interested. And so yeah, in that sense, I don't get anything from those books, so I don't think it's worth for me reading them. And if I read Orwell again, I would probably get those misogynistic vibes from it, so I don't need to read it. But on the other hand, if I read books from authors that are still problematic, but those problems don't seep into their books, then I think it's still worth for me to read, because it is still enjoyable and a learning experience. So yeah, those are my current thoughts on problematic authors and how to treat those books. Of course, it will also be great if within that context, like if you read, for example, a problematic author that has transphobic views, you can complement that with books by trans authors to like balance things out, so that's not like the one single view. And maybe it is just me that doesn't see those things on those books because I don't identify as trans or as other things that I might be blind to, but I am sensitive to misogyny because I am a woman. That is very well possible as well. But yeah, I just this is it turned out a bit of a rambly video, but let me know if you have any thoughts on this. If you have read these two books as well and you have had similar thoughts and similar feelings about this. And yeah, until next video, bye!